Hello everyone, welcome to my channel. Today we will paint urban scene in watercolor based on this photo that I took at the Astor Place in New York City. So if we look at this photo, it is quite a complicated scene because the iPhone captures almost all the details. So of course I am going to make this whole area much more simple. And I like the contrast between these light trees against the dark background. And what draws me to this scene is actually the action here. I like, the dogs are saying hello to each other, and there's someone paying attention to this action happening. So I like photos that also capture some action. And we are going to greatly simplify background, like all these things in the midground. I don't care what they are. I'm going to simplify them in value study. So once the value study makes sense, then I will follow the value study, especially for these parts, because they are not the focal point. For instance, if you look, there are person walking by, there's some like Christmas wreath. I don't care about these details. Let's get going. And these are the colors that we will be using today. And these are the other materials we will be using. I did a rough value study before the painting because this is a complicated scene, but I didn't record it. Please check out videos from Cafe Watercolor and Evansen if you want to learn about how to do value study. And I forgot to record the first part of the pencil sketching. Here I'm happy with the rough sketch, so I'm darkening the lines for the major shapes. When doing the pencil sketch, I'm looking at both my value study and the reference photo. The value study helps me to simplify in my pencil drawing, especially for the background and the midground. Don't draw everything you see in the reference photo. And I'm using a kneaded eraser to remove excess graphite. I'm using a masking fluid paint for the letter Cafe and some highlighted parts. You can also use a brush or ruling pen to apply masking fluid. Make sure the casting shadows are all in the right places. I am using a watercolor paper block today, so I am only wetting one side of the paper. Because I'm only wetting one side, the paper will dry faster. So I'm putting on a lot of water for the paper to soak in. While waiting for the paper to absorb the water, I am mixing some puddles of colors needed for the first wash. These are the three primary colors I choose. For yellow, I'm using aureolin, a cool yellow. It is better to use the ink freshly squeezed out of tube so that it is a pure bright yellow for the light parts of the tree. For red, I'm actually using burnt sienna. It can warm up the aureolin to make orange hues and also mix with French ultramarine to make some delicious darks. French ultramarine is a slightly warm blue. If mixed with a warm yellow, then it will only make dull greens. That is why I choose a cool yellow. Both burnt sienna and French ultramarine are granulating, which help to create some textures for the dark. Here I'm also pre-mixing French ultramarine and burnt sienna. For the first wash, I'm focusing on the lightest value, as well as giving some undertones for the dark parts. As for the architecture in the background, I am not going to paint the scaffoldings as it is in the background. I'm giving it a warm undertone with aureolin and burnt sienna in certain areas to make it more interesting. Now I'm painting the sunlit trees. Since I already have the orange color on my brush, I'm starting from the outside warmer parts and then move on to the cooler yellow parts. and let the pigments mingle on paper. I'm also adding some light green colors mixed from French ultramarine and aureoling. I am using a clean brush to lift the colors that flow into this part. Now I'm mixing a light grayish color to give this panel some color. For this area in shades, I'm just going in with the bluish gray. This will be the color of those white posts in shadow. For this glass building, I decided to use a cool green. That's why I'm using Windsor blue to mix a light green. I'm adding some textures to the trees while it is still damp. Now I'm switching to a flat brush to paint the cafe. I'm adding a bit French ultramarine to burnt sienna to make it cooler. This wash for the cafe exterior doesn't have to be in one shade. It can vary a bit from cooler to warmer brown. This building is mostly in mid and dark values. So in this first wash, I'm already going for the mid value here. I'm not strictly following Andy Evansen's value study method here. As you can see, I'm using French ultramarine here. It doesn't matter whether I'm using brown or blue at this stage, as it will be dark value eventually. If I'm using French ultramarine now, I'll just darken it with brown later. No details are needed for the interior of the cafe. Just need to add various colors for the first wash, preferably warm colors as it is lit. Before continuing with the interior of the cafe, I'm re-wetting the surface as I saw it is getting dry, so that there won't be hard edges when I get to this part later. I don't usually like using masking fluid, but for this painting it is much easier to use masking fluid to preserve those thin lines of lighter value, so that you don't need to worry too much while applying dark colors. This is the lit part of the ground, so I'm giving it some warmth with aureoling and burnt sienna. To avoid hard edges, I am going over surrounding parts as long as they are darker than this part. For the ground that is in shade, I'm giving it a light brownish wash for now. There is a stripe of lit part on the ground by the cafe, so I'm adding some yellow here. I am introducing cadmium red as a highlight color. I'm using it for the hat of this lady. Since the paint spreads widely, it means the paper is a bit too wet. So I'm using paper towel to dry the spots I want to drop in color now. I'm also using cadmium red for this man's cardigan. In this first wash, I'm just giving his pants a brown color. For skin color, I'm also mixing burnt sienna and aureoling. I'm also adding it to the interiors of the cafe. This is a glass or plastic panel, so it is kind of transparent. So I'm adding in some background colors here. These people at the cafe are mostly in shades, so it doesn't matter what color you use at this first stage. I will paint their clothing in dark colors at later stages anyway. All the colors I use except for Windsor Blue are lifting colors, so it is very easy to remove these paints if accidents happen. Just dab it with a clean paper towel. There are a lot of things in this area in the midground. I can't even tell what they are in the photo, and there's no need to. Simplify them so that they don't compete for attention. As long as the values are correct, it will work. Right now, I'm just giving them a light grayish wash. The same for this car. Just need to get the basic shape and the values correct, and the viewers will read it as a car. I'm giving it a warm undertone because it reflects the red color in front of it. Because this white plate is in shadow, I am giving it a light blue wash. Don't go too dark. I'm taking a hockey brush and making a thick, dark mixture with French ultramarine and burnt sienna. The paper in this area is almost dry. I'm using it to paint the dark values for the background buildings. Always make more mixture than you think you might need. If it runs out in the middle of painting wet on dry, you might leave hard edges. I'm switching to a smaller flat brush to work on the parts adjacent to other shapes. For the parts outlining the trees, I switch to a dry round brush and just brush it to smoothen the edges. You can leave some of these lines created by the hockey brush to represent scaffoldings. If you've completely covered this part with dark paints, we can still retrieve some light lines later. Pressing down the brush to create some dry brush texture. So we're negatively painting the shape of these trees. Now I'm mixing a light greenish color to further shape the trees by adding some mid-value shapes. I am mixing the same dark color with very little water, and I am intensifying the background. If the brush leaves lines like this, I am keeping them for textures. Use something hard, for example, palette knife, credit card. I just grabbed a tool used for removing paper from watercolor blocks to scratch off some paints while the paper is damp but not too wet. To represent some lit scaffolding structures, try to vary the distance between and the length of these lines so they look more natural. If you don't like the marks you made, you can fix them by brushing in the same dark color used earlier. It has to be quite dry so that you don't introduce excess water. While I still have this dark mixture on my brush, I am fixing some details. I'm mixing Windsor blue and aureoling to make a slightly darker cool green for the mid-value parts on the glass building on the right. Since this borders the cafe, I am mixing a darker, cooler brown and I'm going to paint the cafe so that it won't leave any hard edges. As you can see, once I lay down this dark brown on the blue, it just becomes a very dark, cool brown. But of course, you can start with brown in the mid value and deepen it with more French ultramarine in the dark value. I saw that the value and the color here are incorrect, so I'm lifting off the paint with a clean damp brush and paper towel. And I'm giving it a light brown wash as it is in mid value. Leave the rough shape of these dogs. For the black clothing, I'm mixing sepia and French ultramarine to make a darker black. I'm using alizarin crimson for the shadow on the red hat. I find value study especially helpful for these parts. Help you just to focus on the value but not the actual things. As they are in shadow and not the focal point, more details are actually distracting. I'm picking up some green color on my palette to paint the jacket this man is wearing. If some highlights are lost, you can lift it with a clean, damp brush. Taking a break and then waiting for the paper to completely dry. If you only wet one side of the paper, it dries faster. So you can always wait for it to be completely dry and re-wet the surface. I am making a gray mixture with the same pigments, but I'm also adding a bit aureoling to make a pale greenish gray for this area close to the tree. Then I use the gray mixture to paint the shadow area under the scaffolding. We're going to negatively paint the white post. That is, we're leaving out the shape of these white posts. As these are in shadow, they don't need to be perfectly straight. Again, if not happy with the shape, you can lift it off with tissue paper. Do this for the rest of the posts. Be careful when it's next to the focal point. Leave out some white gaps as it is the sunlit part on the face. Deepen areas with thicker paints. Now I'm re-wetting the cafe and adjust some shadow areas. For certain shapes, it is easier to use a flat brush. You can create some textures in the shadow areas. For this part, we only need some suggestions of shapes. Re-wet the surface so that it can be fuzzy. You can vary the dark mixture a little bit for the jacket and the paints. One can be warmer and one can be cooler, so that it is not just a big block of dark color. Mix a thicker paint for the shadow and folds on his clothing. I saw that the paint spread out easily, so I switched to a synthetic brush, because that means the paper is a bit too wet and the synthetic brushes hold less water. I'm scratching off some paint with my fingernails to retrieve some highlights. Rewet the surface as you go, but don't use too much water. No idea what that is, maybe a temporary structure with metal surface, but that doesn't matter. I'm just deepening the area surrounding it so that it reads as a lit structure against some dark background. No one needs to know what it is. Add some branches and the trunk for the trees. Don't go too dark as the foliage is very light. I picked up some dirty aureoling from my palette and splattered it to add some texture to the foliage. You can also adjust the splatters with your brush. You can also directly make some marks with your brush, but don't overwork it. I'm happy with the trees now, so I'm moving on. For this car in the midground, the value study is also helpful to simplify it. If it reads like a car in black and white in your value study, right now you just need to follow your value study. That's it. Not much more detail is needed at this stage. I'm picking up pure cadmium red to paint the jacket. This would be the mid value. For his pants, I'm just picking up some dirty blue color. I pick up some mixture of aureoling and burnt sienna on the palette to darken his face in shadow, leaving only a strip of light on the right side. Then I use some dark brownish color on the palette for his hair. I change his color to a darker color because it is just easier. I'm using alizarin crimson for the shaded parts of the red jacket. I'm not going to paint any facial features, just slightly deepen the left side of the face to make it more 3D. That will be all for this guy. Making the same dark mixture with French ultramarine and burnt sienna and paint the clothing for this guy now. Leave out the lit part on his jacket. Picking up the skin color mixture, I am painting his hand, let it blend with the dark color, then move on to the face. Add a bit dark color for the hair. He is wearing sunglasses, so I'm just dropping 2 dots of dark color and let it get fuzzy. If it's too clear and sharp, it will become distracting. Use a very light gray color to add some folds on the lid side. When painting this person, remember to leave a gap between this person and the person in black so that you don't cover the lip part of the dark clothing. I'm using pure alizarin crimson to darken some folds on the red jacket. Now the last figure. I'm going over with a medium value grayish wash first. Then go in with a darker mixture so there are softer transitions. You can retrieve highlight by lifting the paint with a clean damp brush. I started to paint the dog leash, but then I decided to finish her outfit first. I decided to give this person a reddish beanie with burnt sienna. Negative painting here. Adjust the shape of the car so as to leave out the highlight on her coat. While I'm adjusting the shape of the car, I'm also adjusting the shape of this block. This side of this block is slightly darker, so now it looks more like a cubic. Now the dogs. Again, no need to paint any facial details of these dogs. Just stick to the value study and go from lighter to darker values. For the white dog, paint shaded parts in light ultramarine blue first. Then wetting wet some raw umber or yellow ochre, or in this case you can also use burnt sienna if you don't want to introduce new color. The same goes for these dogs. Even fewer details are needed because they're further back. There is a thin line of shadow here, so I'm brushing in some light gray. For the shadow in the foreground, re-wet the paper first. Go over beyond the edge of the shadow so that it has a soft edge. Make a dark mixture with French ultramarine and burnt sienna. This mixture doesn't need to be very dark. Even though it is a shadow, it only needs to be darker than the lit ground. Splatter some clean water to create cauliflowers to make the shadow more interesting. Now add shadows for everything. You can also splatter some dark paint to create more texture. After all, a big shape of dark color can be boring if there are no interesting textures. Now I'm switching to the smallest rigger I have to paint the dog leash. I realized that this part needs some adjustment. It is a glass or plastic panel, so you are supposed to see the tree trunk. So I'm adding a very light shape of tree trunk here. I'm also adding a little detail to this glass building and keeping it to the minimum. You don't need to wait until the next day to do this, but you do have this option. I am removing the masking fluid with this special eraser. Then I'm using a synthetic dagger brush to adjust the shape and smoothen the edges so that these white shapes look more natural. And I use the brush to retrieve any highlights as needed. At this stage, we are just adjusting highlights and the shadows. I'm adding a very light yellow wash over these letters to tone them down a little bit. I'm adding the shadow to make them look more 3D. These are all very subtle. Then I'm adding the shadows they cast. Some final adjustment of values. And this is the final painting. Don't forget to click like and subscribe. Bye!